can imagine almost in the darkest parts of this bog what it was like to go back to those times, you know, and to go back to that sort of the mysticism and the mystery that's in the bog. You can still, it's almost tangible, or it was almost tangible at times in Mount Lucas for me anyway. We don't actually have any upstanding Neolithic monuments in this area except in the bog. So that's why this site here, Site 3 Road 23, is so significant. We have evidence for people during the Bronze Age, the Iron Age, up to the medieval period. You know, there's towers and trackways crossing this bog between ecclesiastical sites, between settlements. And it went on, you know, for thousands of years. This bog functioned as a place, you know, where people lived and worked and, you know, and benefited from. So they would have cut the wood from the periphery of the bog and made the structures and the roadways from that. Many of them, the condition of them was so good that they actually still had the bark intact. What's really interesting about it as well is that all of that work was done with stone axes. They didn't have, metal hadn't been invented, if you like. They cultivated the ground, they had animals, and they were the first communities to settle down. And they also were the people who brought a sort of a structured religion to Ireland as well. And you can see evidence of that at the great tombs in Newgrange and also the Neolithic cemetery up in Carramore in County Sligo. People went here to deposit their riches there as offerings to the gods that they believed were here. Bog bodies have been found in the wider area. They seem to have believed that if they put those people there, that life would change for them, their luck would change. This work is important because by looking back at communities in the past, we can look at our own communities in the present day. If we don't look back, if we don't respect our culture, if we don't respect our past, we're like a tree without roots. There's nothing to sustain us. There's nothing to make us go forward.
Before Bordemona came along, this area would have had high unemployment, an awful lot of bogs, a lot of flooding in winter, and not much wealth in the area. Todd Andrews claimed in his autobiography that when he came down to visit the Midlands in the early days of Bordemona, he found that the poverty and unemployment was worse than anything in the most deprived part of Dublin inner city. So the dream was to create all the wealth that was lying dormant in these bogs and employment and stop people having to emigrate. It would also replace coal and we'd have our own fuel. The first survey work was carried out in the early 1950s, and as the years went on, they started draining more and more bogs because it takes a long time to drain a bog and get it ready for development. In the late 1940s, Bordemona started what was called the first development programme, which was producing sod turf. The second development programme was based on Russian peat production, which was mill peat. There was a huge expansion then. That led to a bigger expansion of mill peat production, and especially in Offaly. Mount Lucas would have been peat produced here up to about 10 years ago. Now, some parts of the Dairy Green group are still producing milk peat for Eton Dairy Power Station. This area here would have been in production for possibly almost 40 years, and now it's cut out and you can see the wind farm all around us.
It's widely accepted that science is telling us that if we're going to maintain the rise in global temperatures, if we're going to maintain those within the 2 degrees that we believe might allow the planet the ability to continue to exist and to continue to operate in the way it does today, we have to significantly reduce emissions of greenhouse gases globally by up to 80% by 2050 from the 1990 levels. That's what the science is telling us. And what that means for Europe, what it means for Ireland, is we effectively have to completely transform the way that we generate and consume energy. And the focus is really on decarbonising our power system. And Ireland has a number of different options that it may use ultimately to decarbonise the power system. Biomass, hydro, perhaps even in time wave and tidal. Solar will certainly come into the mix. But at the moment, predominantly low-cost option that Ireland has is in development of onshore wind farms. And the sort of scale of farm that you see here is certainly contributing very, very significantly to the emissions reduction on the Irish power system, and is contributing to the decarbonisation of the economy. It is that transition and the need to transition to a low carbon economy that's driving these types of developments and will continue to do so in the coming decades. And this site here would have been very, very important from the point of view of provision of energy for the state for over 50 years, in that peat production from this particular location would have serviced the local briquette factory in Croghan, which is just to the north of the site, and would also have fed 3 or 4 of the Midlands peat-fired power stations which came into being in the mid-60s and ultimately retired in the late 90s. So for up on 50 years, this site was providing energy to the state. We're moving into an era where the site itself can remain a very, very important site from the point of view of energy production for the state, perhaps for decades to come, and hopefully in a way that we believe now to be very, very sustainable from the point of view of environmental protection. The option of doing nothing just doesn't seem to make any commercial sense.
Throughout the last 2.5 years over the construction phase, there was a very good team spirit built up on the wind farm.
In terms of the overall timeline, work started on the site in about February 2012. We would have established pretty much the entire footprint of the road network on the site. During 2013, the main activity was completion of the foundations for the turbines. And also the completion of the construction of the substation. Next main challenge was getting the turbine components to sites themselves. There's 4 sections of tower which range between 20 and 35 metres in length. Turbine components themselves come into Dublin Port, so on the route from Dublin Port to the site, certain alterations to the local road network were required. In 2014, main focus was on the construction of the turbines themselves and doing the final connection of the turbines back to the substation.
The 100-metre hub height gives this site the advantage of extracting more energy from the wind. Each turbine generates at 3 megawatts at max capacity. The wind farm here will generate enough electricity for approximately 45,000 homes.
we assess areas once peat production has stopped to highlight how we can enhance and rehabilitate the sites post-peat production. What we've found in our work over that time is that there's just great potential for biodiversity. You really have to work with the condition that's there, see what plants actually want to grow here, and just work with them. But this is a really interesting spot here. At the base here we have this 10,000-year-old pine stump. We have these mosses here. This moss here is really important in stabilising the peat surface. We also have here these fantastic little creatures called lichens. They are a symbiotic relationship between a fungus and an algae. As well as the mosses and the lichens, we have these willows coming in, and we have birch. So we have several birch while it's still an open habitat. We get these other really interesting plants like hawkspit. This is this little plant here which is just about to come into flower. And we get the marsh orchids, and in a month's time this whole area will be just a spectacular array of early purple orchids. So all in this one spot we have at least 20 species. We did a BioBlitz in Lochbora Discovery Park a few years ago, and we found almost 1,000 species in a 24-hour period. So already within Mount Lucas we have established very mature woodland areas, and then we have a fantastic mix of shallow wetland areas. It's really a haven for bees, butterflies, and the full range of creepy crawlies, because we don't use pesticides here. And then of course you might be lucky enough to see 2 herons flying up from the wetland. We have benefited from harvesting the peat, and we recognise that that has been a great contribution nationally and locally in communities like this. But we also recognise that when peat production stops, putting nature back, or allowing nature to come back in, is going to provide a whole range of other ecosystem goods and services. It's going to be very significant.